I first learnt about this issue through a client of mine who had a conviction for a homosexual offence, the offence of buggery, as it was then known. And quite shockingly, he was charged with that crime when his parents reported sexual abuse that was committed against him by his employer. They charged the perpetrator, but they also charged my client, who was a, I think, 15-year-old boy.
How could someone who was the victim of sexual assault be prosecuted and convicted?
And most people wouldn't know that the effect of having a conviction is that you have that for life.
It's been more than 30 years that those people have been carrying those convictions for crimes which have simply not been considered a crime since 1981. In 1980, there was finally momentum to change the Crimes Act and the Sentencing Act so that historical homosexual offences were no longer considered a crime. People who already had a conviction recorded against them were not expunged. In other words, those convictions remained.
I worked with people like Jamie Gardner and others to speak to the then member for Paran, a Liberal Party member, Clem Newton-Brown. We spoke to Clem about the issue of trying to do something around the issue of historical homosexual convictions.
Let's remember, this is something which no government has touched in the past. Jamie Gardner started lobbying for this in 1977, and when the Hamer government decriminalised in the early 80s, this issue was live then, and it hasn't gone away since.
We really worked closely with Clem to provide him with a paper that outlined what we thought should happen in Victoria, and Clem was able to talk to his colleagues in Parliament and the then Premier Dennis Napthine to get enough support within the government to finally announce at Midsummer Carnival back in January 2014 that the Liberal National Government would be legislating to introduce a scheme to expunge these past historical convictions.
For me, I just thought this was an issue that affected the community and that I represented in Paran. It was the right thing to do.
We need to make sure that we lift that burden of stigma and discrimination against people who have been discriminated for a very long time. Then that's what we should do, and that's what we have done.
I think that we can expect to see a formal public apology to all of the people who were victims of those laws. Of course, many of them are dead now, but many of them are still alive.
If a person has a record expunged, it will have a number of very important consequences for them. It will remove the stigma that's attached to having criminal records, but will also unlock a lot of other impediments that come from having a criminal record.
Criminal records now can come up not only for employment, but all sorts of things, even for volunteering. Once the conviction has been expunged, a person will be able to say in a court of law, I have never had a conviction.
There's been an amendment to the Equal Opportunity Act which will add a new attribute to prohibit discrimination on the basis of an expunged homosexual conviction.
There are real cases, there are real injustices to be fixed here, and it's a great thing that it's happening.